But let's move on to the next fight here, because we got a co-main event of the evening, and it's a little bit surprising, right? You see a guy like Bogdan Guskov, and he comes into the UFC. He's on a main card billing. He's fighting Volkan Ozdemir, and he's about a plus 145 underdog, right? He comes out and he's throwing hands. They're both landing big shots. Volkan was wearing it on his face a little bit. Then all of a sudden, boom, Volkan, no time Ozdemir lands that big shot, hurts him bad. He actually lands a beautiful takedown before this. I should mention, he lands a beautiful takedown. Bogdan Guskov worked back up to his feet. I was impressed. I was a little bit surprised. And then you see all of a sudden, right, he gets clipped with a big shot. He gets taken down again, and then he gets finished on the ground. UFC debut, goes up in flames as a plus 145 dog, but I thought he showed some signs of promise, right? He went out there, he was willing to attempt his offense. He was very aggressive, and he was landing some good shots. The problem was he was there to be hit. He had that UFC jitter. He was out there throwing a couple shots, looking like he was, on a highway, staring at headlights. My man was just, feeling the moment a little bit. And Volkan Ozdemir, not a soft landing in your UFC debut, but I thought he was capable of winning that fight. And I think he showed it in the fight despite losing it, right? He went out there, he showed some of his promise, but ultimately he was overcome by a better, more experienced fighter on the night. Next up, they move him to the preliminary card. They give him Zach Pauga, and he is once again installed as an underdog, this time about a plus 110 dog on the money line, and he goes out there and delivers Zach Pauga in the first round, knockout, brutal fashion, left him lying on the canvas, standing over him, shouting, and he looked like he still wanted to fight that night. Bogdan Guskov shows up ready to fight. I think his biggest concern, his biggest flaw, potentially, is his chin. I just don't think he's got a great chin. I think his ground game is a little bit suspect. I think he makes some bad decisions on the mat at times, and I think that pure technique for technique, Ryan Spann is probably a better technical grappler than a guy like Bogdan Guskov. But again, back to the positive qualities of Guskov, I think he's a really dangerous guy. I think he's a really aggressive guy. And I think you got to put him out, or you've got to put him in a choking position, to get one over on him. I think that in this spot, you got a guy like Ryan Spann, and he looks like he should win every UFC fight. He's built big, strong, long, athletic. He's got some speed on his punches. But for me, he's not a very natural fighter at all. A lot of what he does is extremely wild and reckless. I think he puts himself in a position to fail way more often than I would be comfortable with, especially considering the price tag that you're being asked to pay for the privilege. About a minus 200, a little over 65%. And we're talking about a guy who just invites a lot of risk. I thought he had knocked out Johnny Walker 2 or 3 times in a fight that he ends up getting knocked out in the first round. He kept landing all these big shots, but the finishing instincts were so poor. And he's throughout his career struggled with, putting himself in terrible positions when he's grappling. The guy's got an excellent guillotine, and he's basically won all of his fights that he's ever won via submission using that guillotine or a rear naked choke popping out on somebody's back. He's a long guy. Like I mentioned, he's got limb length. He can go out there, strangle people. But outside of that, I've just seen this guy make so many boneheaded decisions on the mat. He's going against Nikita Krylov. He ends up in the top position and gets triangled almost instantly. He's going with Anthony Smith, and, Anthony Smith is out there, passing around to his back, getting on top of him, putting him in some really terrible positions. And he's also just very hittable for a light heavyweight. This guy has fought a pretty meager level of competition throughout his run in the UFC. And basically, the way his fights have broken down is his best win in the UFC is Dominic Reyes, I would say by a country mile, right? A guy who fought for the title. He knocked him out in the first round. But outside of that, there's really not a standout win, I feel, on Ryan Spann's resume. He's fought a lot of guys that are very average in the UFC and barely eked out wins. He was minus 400 against smiling Sam Alvey, and he ends up eking out a close split decision in that spot. And you look at a guy like Bogdan Guskov, he's typically kill or be killed. He's got an ability to knock people out. He's got an ability to submit people, but mostly he's a knockout artist. And mostly he's going to look to go out there and crack people in the first 1 or 2 rounds. But we also have to remember, that Ryan Spann, despite having power, despite having some submission ability, he's been finished, I want to say 6 times in the UFC or something crazy. Like, let me just pull up the record because I don't want to speak out of my ass. But Ryan Spann is 21-9 overall as a professional. He's been finished 3 times, in the UFC. It's 6 times overall as a professional. He's been finished. So Anthony Smith beat him via split decision. Anthony Smith also submitted him in the very first round via rear naked choke. Nikita Krylov submitted him in the very first round via triangle choke. Johnny Walker knocked him out in the very first round using elbows and hammer fists. Carl Roberson knocked him out in the very first round using elbows. And he's been elbowed several times to a defeat. Oftentimes he's shooting a double leg. He gets complacent. Saif Saud is losing his mind, having an aneurysm on the side. Move, Ryan, move. No, Ryan. And he doesn't move, and he gets TKO'd there. Anyway, so when you look at those spots, he's a very frustrating guy, and he's not a guy I feel like I trust at the price tag. Also, you just got to think that light heavyweight's a little bit volatile overall. Ryan Spann, he's got these things on paper that make him look good. He's fast. He's got the UFC experience. He's got some length. He's got some height. But then you go back and look, and it's like Carl Roberson's tiny compared to Spann. He's still able to knock him out in the first round. Nikita Krylov was kind of getting horsed around a little bit in that fight, was still able to find the submission. Then you look, who is Ryan Spann beating? Let's go through the list of wins because I said I wasn't altogether very impressed. He came in overweight, I believe, for the Dominic Reyes fight, and he won that fight via knockout in the first round. But hey, hats off to him. No problem there. Then he goes out there and he submits Iwan Kutalaba in the first round, and Iwan Kutalaba is 6-9 in the UFC. So I don't really rate that as a win. Like, Iwan Kutalaba is a below average UFC fighter, period, point blank. Then you look at, I mentioned the Anthony Smith fight. He lost that fight. He beat Misha Serkinov via TKO in the first round. Misha Serkinov went on a horrible run to end his career, 4 straight losses. And he also ended his UFC career 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 2-7 in his last 9 UFC fights. Like, Misha Serkinov was just not in a great place, and I don't really rate that win either. He beat Smilin Sam Alvey, who is now in Karate Combat. He beat Devin Clark, who is another guy who's very flaky, 8-9 in the promotion, so a losing record in the UFC. He beat the ghost of Antonio Nogueira. No disrespect to the legend, but that was a far past his due date legend in that fight. He beat Luis Henrique via decision, no longer with the promotion, and Emmanuel Sordi on the Contender Series. I mean, these are just not high-level fighters. So, yeah, I mean, he's done a decent job, but he doesn't strike me as the guy that's like, super reliable, super consistent. And, I did mention this to the patrons earlier, but I'll mention this to everybody, give a little free game to everybody because I noticed it myself. And I thought it was an interesting trend. But Ryan Spann was favored last time out to beat Anthony Smith, and he lost that fight. He was an underdog in the 6 fights prior. So it's just, interesting to see the market, kind of feel like, hey, he got robbed a little bit in his last fight. So now he's a -200 favorite in this fight against a younger guy who's probably a little bit more dynamic than Smith. It just seems a little bit interesting to me. So, yeah, I lean towards a dogger pass situation. The under is like -250, disgusting. I lean towards it going under, but it's just not a price that I feel there's any value on. So, yeah, I think that it's a fun fight, an interesting fight. Let's see what the chat has to say about it. But I'm leaning towards a dogger pass situation. I think somebody could get submitted in this one as well. Norashi says where Lord of the Rings was made. Shout out. Daz Dillinger says, big ups on Ryan Garcia too. That ref was on some BS. You are not lying, my brother. I'm at a point where I can never bet Spann at chalk again, says Kadeem, and I tend to agree with you. Hitman says +170 is good enough for me to fade Ryan Spann. Blessings, my brother. Good luck to you. SD Crusader says Spann is a 50-50 fighter. I tend to agree with the sentiments of the chat today. Daz also says Ryan is a bit of a mental midget, but I'll admit if he goes straight to his grappling, I reckon he can make it look easy. I think there's a path to that, but I also think, Spann is averaging like 1 point something takedowns per 15 minutes. I don't know how good he is as a top player. I think he takes a lot of unnecessary risks and kind of gets out of position at times, but he's definitely a big body. You don't want him on top of you. He can be a dangerous guy to deal with from that position. So That's a great point, Daz. But there we have it. I'm leaning towards a dog or pass co-main event situation, but admittedly, highly volatile fight.